My name is Brian Walksman, 303 Organic Cannabis, and I'm excited to bring you guys to day 2 of something that is near and dear to my heart, trying to educate the world on understanding why living soil is the future, in our opinion, to cultivate cannabis as medicine. I wanted to really thank everybody that was a part of yesterday. A lot of information went down. Of course, those are on replay for you guys for 30 days. Wanted to give a quick shout out to Pit Moss, our main sponsor, as well as Gringo, Michigan, and Blue Mats for sponsoring yesterday. And I want to give a quick shout out to Miller Soils of Lewis Miller for sponsoring our show this morning with Kevin Jodrey. For you guys that are new to cannabis farming or just new to cannabis farming at this level, Kevin Jodrey, in my opinion, is a living legend. He is well known in the industry as far as educating, as well as pheno hunting and going out of his way to provide real education for the cannabis community. So I'm excited to pass the torch to Kevin, and let's get started here, guys. And I want you guys to know that this is going to be all about more of Q&A. So please keep your questions going, and we're going to rock with a lot of Q&A all day today. So Kevin?
Right on, man. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be able to be part of a good group to do some cool education. Leighton hit me up to talk about understanding THC production, which was funny because I'm not a chemist. But THC production has been fascinating me forever. And it's such an important topic because it's not only about sales of a product, but it's also a reflection of our metabolic process. And so what I figured is that we'd start the lecture off and go into what really is primary and secondary metabolites. So this way we can kind of understand what has taken place within the plant. And then we can understand how the plant has to really kind of compete in order to produce and create all the different chemistry that's within inside it. And how that competition affects our numbers depending on what we're trying to achieve, whether it's higher flavonoids, higher terpenes, higher lipids, higher THC, higher CBD. It's really all the same. It's a chemical powerhouse of a plant that we're working with, and we're trying to figure out, how do we optimize it and where's the balance. And I'm gonna go into some indoor also, just because some of the indoor model allows us to talk about how some of these numbers are being driven, I want to say artificially, but it'll allow us to see some parallels. So what I'll do is I'll shoot out a chunk, and if anybody got any questions, what I'll do is let's just go for a little while, and then you can throw something. I got the Q&A here, and I can read it and then shoot some information back. So let's go. So primary and secondary metabolites is what this is really about, and for us, it's really about the secondary metabolite. And so a metabolite is just really it's an intermediate or end product of metabolism. And a primary metabolite is directly involved in normal plant growth, development, and reproduction, something like ethylene, where it's required for the plant to exist and live. A secondary metabolite is not directly involved in the process, but usually has important ecological functions. Examples would be antibiotics and pigments such as resins and terpenes. So what this means is that for us, the way I think the best way to look at it is that when you're talking about cannabis, we have to separate these two realities. One is the cultivar and one is the chemovar. So one is the plant itself, and the other is the chemical production that comes from that primary metabolite process. And so the issue I think that we've had in cannabis primarily for so long is that we focus on one or the other, and we don't realize that they're most definitely connected. And the ability to understand the process between them is important. So we're going to go focus just really today just on secondary metabolism, right? So we're not going to worry about so much the primary portion of it. That would be plant growth itself. You've had some brilliant people talking about how to drive plant production. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to the next stage of it. And we're going to talk about secondary metabolites, and they're also called specialized metabolites. And they were first really mentioned in the early 1900s, and they described secondary metabolites as the end products of nitrogen metabolism. They aid in a host of important functions such as protection, competition, and species interaction, but they're not necessary for survival. one of the most defining qualities of secondary metabolites is their specificity, not just specific to a specific lineage or even species, but they also have the ability for plants to have or animals to have evolved to be able to resist those secondary metabolites. So you have butterflies that eat plants that typically would be toxic. That toxin now goes into the body of that animal, which then protects it from being devoured by other plants. And so secondary metabolites can be good and bad. It doesn't have to be all positive. It's just really chemical formulations that created. They're not essential for life and growth, but they are important for the survival and in the interaction and how the plant works with stress. And so we don't need to have a secondary metabolite operation that's exceedingly efficient if the plant isn't having high stress. So if the plant is in a buffered situation, we would see a lowered secondary metabolite production as a result. And it lets you start to have these understandings of, when we take a look at lab analysis, why do we see higher THC numbers, high CBD numbers, high CBG numbers, higher terpenes, higher flavonoids? And we see that in certain environments, you'll see stress applied that creates that occurrence. And so the indoor model works off of artificial lighting, typically chemically driven or mineral driven nutrition, and an incredibly optimal environment, so that what we have is we have the ability for the plant to maintain respiration the entire time. That situation has been in play for a really long time. We've been running indoor in the same Hoagland formula as the model for your indoor base nutrients. And what we see is, if we go back to 64, right? So 64 is when Mechoulam identifies THC. And all of a sudden now there's THC is identified. And if you go forward so many years, you start to take a look at DEA numbers of their claim that cannabis was doubling in strength, and it was going from a 3% up to a 6%. And so we start to see these numbers, but none of us really are so concerned with it, because we don't have access to labs, and there isn't really any scientific papers for us to look at in any form. And I don't think it was until the greenhouse came out, where the cannabis cups in Holland came out, and it was, let's see, who was it? It was Serious Seeds. Serious Seeds created White Russian, and White Russian came out at 20%, and that would have been in the early 90s. And so 20% THC in the early 90s was considered the zenith of cannabis THC production. And we have that number. And if we go back to that 90s, that's when really you started seeing indoor firing up. We were throwing so much product out at that time, and we were all, so interested in what is the high THC, but we only had, very limited lab access. And it wasn't until really 215 came out, and I'd say, around 206, 207, 208 is when you really started to see the first labs appear in California. And it started allowing us to do testing of our products and get an idea of where we were at numerically. And at that time, I had a West Coast dog that was pulling like 29.8, which was just, unbelievable at that time. And the irony was it had incredibly high THC numbers. Cannabinoid numbers were high, but in flavonoid and in terpene production, very low. So the enjoyment of it was not there, but the numerics were there. And so with the indoor model, and we're just going to go into that because it's really where a lot of this is re-evolved from, because we all at one point were outside, then we almost all of us went indoor. And then we come back out now into the sun again. But the indoor lets us take a look at some interesting components pertaining to the metabolic process. And so we had good production under the old mogul socket bulbs, right? So we were all typically running HPS. You'd have MH in your vegetative so that you could have a little bit more chlorophyll production, little tighter, greener plant. And then you'd switch into your HPS lighting, so you got some more of the red, so you could get a higher production of actual plant material. And the numbers at that time, were very good in terms of yield numbers, because they were kind of limited by your reflector. And so today we would say, 4 pounds under 1,000 watts of input is an excellent number. And at that time in the 90s, if you could pull 2 pounds off 1,000, it was an excellent number. And the difference in it wasn't that they doubled the quantity under the light. It's that they doubled the square foot under the light. And so we would pull, 2 plus under off of 16. Nowadays you're pulling, 4 off of 30, 32 square. So the numbers of quantity of cultivar production haven't really changed much, just the efficiency in which the light is distributed, so that what you have is a much more efficient system of lighting a space. What we've seen, though, is the ability for dialing in of spectrum. And so the idea that all plants focus and function off of a block of light, certain range in band, it leaves one to believe that that's all that's required. And that's really where for us as outdoor growers or full sun growers, you understand that the complexity of the sun is just unbelievable. So we can't replicate it exactly. So what we have is missing information. So if we look at light not just as energy, but also as information, we have lack of information on lighting systems. And so what they did is they started to look into, better lighting systems to increase some of the qualities of the plant. And you started to see the beginning of HPS being run with plasma. They brought plasma in to increase UV. What we know is that some of the low blues and the 400s and UV are what has an incredible impact on your secondary metabolite production. So scientists started weaving in mixed spectrum. They started putting in these plasmas with HPS. And then they started to switch into ceramic metal halides, to where you were catching much more of that blue spectrum to enhance these qualities. And it's always this trade where you're trading something from the cultivar, something from the chemovar. It's very difficult to get both of them to move forward simultaneously. We move into LED production, and that's where this gets really interesting to me, because I was involved in the early development of LEDs in the United States through Heliospectra. So probably around 2007, Heliospectra came to me, and they were from Sweden. And the company came into the U.S. and said, hey, could we use your facility to do LED studies on cannabis? And I thought it was so fascinating that I put together a section in the building, and we utilized this LED experiment run by their scientists who would fly in and operate it. And I would operate the experiment, but they were trying to get their data on what occurs when you change what frequency, what bandwidth of light the plant gets. And then I ran a side-by-side test with HPS and the same cultivar. So cultivars that I was familiar with, we would run them under both systems. And it started to allow me to see what the idea was with using these adjustable LEDs. The LEDs that they brought in had complete control over your bandwidth. So you could adjust and change what length of signal was hitting the plant itself. And what we could see was that it was incredibly complicated system of delivery to create your chemotype. So the LED system had less of a growth factor in the cultivar, but it had an incredible impact in the chemovar, to where what we started to see was, phenomenal flavonoid production. And flavonoids, and I'll go into some of these a little more deeper, but flavonoids are also your pigments, right? And so typically we don't see pigments appear in traditional cultivation until we flush out some of the nitrogen. We let the nitrogen assimilate, the chlorophyll pigment diminishes, we see anthocyanins, we see carotenes, xanthophylls, we see all these colors come out, but after the chlorophyll has been reduced. But with the LED systems that we were playing with, it allowed us to be able to have those pigments appear normally through that cycle. So it wasn't necessarily just the flush, it was the fact that these pigments were being driven out. And what that means is that those levels of pigment were higher in the plant, and therefore your flavonoid production was higher in the plant. And we weren't recording flavonoids at the time. And so this was through, end testing of the product. But what we had was probably, 20, 25% less yield minimum than the side-by-side with the HPS, because the LED systems, they were designing to work in laboratory situations, and the laboratory situation wasn't so important to get more biomass. It was more important to have a beautiful chemistry occurrence so they could work with the medicine that was coming out of it. They saw cannabis as medical cannabis, and what was the cannabinoids they were trying to harvest and grow, and how do we achieve that? And so the systems were dialed in to stimulate primarily your secondary metabolites. And when we focus on that, we end up taking some of the focus away from your primary metabolites in terms of what's occurring with the plant. And you have less of an overall plant, but a unique presentation of what's inside it. And so they take the new LED technology and then they bring it into all the indoor operations around the US now. And most of those aren't tunable, but they've been adjusted at the factory to fit a certain range. Most of them are full spectrum now. And they utilize that situation to efficiently light an operation indoor so that their electricity usage is balanced, but also because the chemotype that comes off of them, the production of that secondary metabolite is typically really well. And the usage of this system gives us a base of lighting so that we're trying to replicate natural sunlight, which I don't think anyone ever will do, and I hopefully no one ever does it, because it would diminish the mystery of what we do so much. So I like the fact that some things are impossible to chase, but in this case, they light the buildings with LEDs, and then what they do is they start to work on your better environment, which we know from outdoor situations. Some places have better environments for vegetative production. Some places have better environments for metabolite production. And they start to dial in the food. So we go from 20% in the 90s, and now we're in the 40s. And so I just took a look at a flower that the COA on it was 40.1. And I used to laugh that it was impossible to get that high, but I really didn't understand the truth of it, that when we get right down to it, the weight, the molecular weight of the cannabinoids, the terps, has such a higher density compared to the vegetative material that it doesn't mean that 40% of that plant has to be trichomes. It's that the fact that the entire plant is literally covered in the capitate stalks, but also in all the other forms of trichs. And when you combine all of them together, the numbers are possible. And so what they work on is how do we take this lighting system that gives us improved THC production, improved chemotyping, and how do we drive a higher level into it? And what they start to see is that the food that's being used traditionally has been focused too heavily on vegetative production, and that development in nutrition has changed dramatically, where from taking the ability to do leaf analysis and then determine where are you in your optimum range, allows them to be able to say, hey, for cannabis, we're pushing too much nitrogen into this plant. And what it's doing is it's focusing too heavily on vegetative production. So they start to dial in the foods. And as they start to do this over the last, say, 5 years, you've seen it. There's a number of companies that I was involved with, on a friendly level, that was doing really comprehensive nutrient testing to where they were going through all the different companies utilizing their products to figure out, who created what and for what direction. And at that time, like a number of years ago, the brand that worked really well for THC and terp production for the purpose of extraction was Mills. So I have no connection to any of these companies, not highlighting any of them. This is just some understanding of how do we steer something indoor, and then we'll go back into metabolite production, how we do outdoor. But the indoor is where you can see the work, because the investment in the indoor was so heavy that it brought in the need for, I say, scientific analysis. So they dial in the food now. So the food becomes better. So what you're having more of your ovule production versus more of leaf production. And what they find, though, is that in this incredible room with the right lighting and the best food and this incredibly buffered environment, so that the VPD, or vapor pressure difference, is always within this reasonable range, and that allows the plant just to transpire so that the cultivar itself is functioning and producing and working. They realize that there's no stress in the bottom end. So the nutrients are primo, but they're not getting the stress. So the light from the indoor, because it's not, even though they call it full spectrum, it's never full spectrum and compared to the sunlight. And we've heard this argument a million times from every light manufacturer on earth about my lights are equal to the sun. And I'm always like, okay. So we just know that that's not true. So therefore, and one of the ways I think that you can really see that is you would typically see hermaphrodite, which is a lot of stress induction in plants to reproduce. You see it under indoor lighting systems far more than you ever see it on outdoor. So the light from indoor is a stressor, and it was being initiated so they could get a better quality production. And they have this dialed in room which reduces stress, and then they have a really dialed in food which reduces stress. And so what they started to realize was that if they started to work with drought stress in the cube or the pot or whatever method they wanted to run, whatever inert media they were running when they were spitting the salt, they started to find that if they reduced the amount of water the plant received in its individual disbursement, and they kept the plant at this level of almost wilt but not, it allowed them to artificially increase the EC in the block or the pot up to almost like 4. So typically 1.8 is a standard EC number for running an indoor salt-based system. And they started to discover that when we started to drive that number up high, it caused the plant huge amounts of water stress in those pots because the salt content was so relatively high. And that salt content allowed them to get phenomenal production on the plant because the uptake was so incredible. So it started to balance out yield with a combination of cannabinoids. And so when we're talking about THC production, I always use indoor as the standard, because the bottom line is I know that an indoor model allows you to do something which is pretty unique, which is to have truly 60, 70, 80-day cycles of 12-12. So you're getting, morning to night sunlight. And anywhere in California where you would receive that, you'd have incredible temperature issues. And so those temperatures change the way the plant functions. So you really, in the world, get such an incredible production as you do indoor, and meaning that the control is unbelievable. And so when we have such an unbelievable control, and we have an ability to measure it and repeat it, it lets us try to figure out, where are we moving with THC production, and how do we achieve it, and where are we going with it. And what's taken place with you as a cultivator is that you have this an economic competition where the plant only has so much plant money to spend on its survival, its growth, its reproduction, and the factors that influence it, the abiotic factors, the things that are pushing the plant from an exterior perspective, wind, sun, temperature, those issues, they create a demand on the plant to perform. And the plant has to create what it needs in order for that plant to thrive. So it will live just fine, but it won't shine. It'll have very little, protection. Indoor is very different in the sense that we have such a buffered environment that it's not as essential. And so what I see with these indoor models, and this is all about metabolites, is that we're able to, use good breeding to drive THC direction. So when it comes to like marker-assisted breeding, the easiest thing to identify and then subsequently move as a trait is cannabinoid and terpenes. So terpenes really are a bigger group that cannabinoids fit under. So when we talk about what are all the secondary metabolites, which are, terpenes, phenolics, glycosides, alkaloids, these families, these chemical classifications that exist, cannabis is unique that it produces cannabinoids, but the cannabinoids really fit under terpenes in terms of secondary metabolites. And so the ability to move that as a breeder is not that difficult. The difficulty in cannabis is really all the other factors: harvest time, morphological characteristics, mold resistance. These other characteristics are more difficult to actually put in and get as a stable breeding goal. But it's been pretty easy to move the cannabinoids. Years ago, when CBD first came out, I was involved in a lot of the original CBD projects. And we were able to take plants that were at 5%, and over the course of 18 months, we were in the 20s. And so CBD was at 5, and then it was in the 20s, and then we see it up in the mid 20s now. And that process of breeding development is what drove that. And so once we start to really swing where the plant's desire is, and then we put it under an appropriate production model, what we have is a result. Now, the issue that we see with the indoor stuff is that the THC numbers are phenomenal, but I never see terps that are really running anything over 4s. Very, in a traditional salt system. Very, very, very few times have I seen those numbers. And I'm not a laboratory. I was the largest lab drop in Humboldt for years. And so the number of flowers that I saw tested and ran through my shop was unbelievable. And because I had such a good relationship with the lab, I was testing everything I could find. So anytime anybody gave me any weed, I would take it and send it out for testing because the cost was so low for me. So it allowed me to test continuously. And it let me start to see, when individuals were doing cultivation, what did the cultivar look like in their hands? So it started to give me some pretty decent ideas of what the plants were that were being sold and what the range of THC production was. Once terpene analysis came out, we started to be able to see what the range in terpenes were. And so you can start to find, a mid-range on a cultivar, where its middle point is. And then you see its low point and its high point. So who hit the high point, who hit the low point, what's the middle? And the indoor operations let us be able to understand, what is the potential of THC, because they're so focused on that direction with the new systems, where the efficiency of the operation gives us the yield, but the science behind the operation is what gives us these ungodly numbers. And the LED systems, because they were tunable in the day, I got to see how they could change the trike shape. You could change dramatically what was taking place. And the ability for an individual to have that type of control indoor is phenomenal, because it lets you swing a direction that you want to. But what we never saw on the indoor in terms of salt grown, and whether it be indoor salt grown, outdoor salt grown, or mixed light salt grown, is that you never had the flavonoid production. And so what we see is that the indoor models of traditional salt models have a huge issue in terms of how the customer perceives flavor. And so we swing THC way to the far end, but at the same time, we're losing some of these other properties because that's where the focus was laid in place. Now, someone just asked, can you expand on how the spectrum of light affects the size or shape of the trike? Well, when Helio came in, they had a fully tunable system. And so I had to connect it to an iPad, and it gave me a control so I could control the diodes across that different wavelengths. And they were in charge of the experimentation because it fit their need. And the data that they collected allowed them to shape their scientific pieces. So what they would do is Tessa would come in, and she would lay out the experiment, and then we would record what took place because we would send the flowers out for analysis. And so we could see that we were pulling in, 20, 25% higher cannabinoid production with the subsequent 20, 25% less weight. So the spectrum of the light has an incredible effect, because if we want to change the size of a basil plant in a greenhouse, we can change the lighting, and we can either elongate or shorten. We can take plants and put them under light spectra where that actually prohibits them from flowering. We can put them under light spectra that it instantly triggers them to flower. And so all those things are control mechanisms utilized. And then someone said, I think sun-grown done right is the best smoke. And I agree. But this isn't a question of what do we think is best right now. It's just really, this is some background of, we're trying to understand THC production, and the highest THC production you see in anywhere is indoor. Okay. So we want to understand why, so that we can then take that understanding and try to figure out how do we move it to our outside production. Okay. So what you have in secondary metabolites is these different families. So you have terpenoids, which are just oxygenated hydrocarbons, different than terpenes, which are just straight hydrocarbons. And they're made up of these isoprene units, and isoprenes help plants fight abiotic stress. It helps to offset high winds, extreme temperatures, droughts, floods, colds, heat. There's 42,000 of known terpenes. In the family of terpenes, we would consider cannabinoids a terpene because it's in a lipid form. But when we take a look at cannabis production, terps and cannabinoids are in the same basket. And so therefore they also compete. And that means that when the plant is producing these substances, it has to make a decision. Does it want more of cannabinoids, or does it want more straight terpenes, say like linalool, neuralidol? What does it desire? And those desires are based off of abiotic stresses that are occurring from outside the plant. And we have an ability to swing it based off of what's taken place in the bottom end. And that's where this will all wrap up into, is in living soil. But we're just moving through this process. And so in this secondary metabolite group, we have terpenoids, which contain cannabinoids. Then you have phenolics, and these are compounds which are most abundant in the plant. So you have the most, if we broke it up into a pie, the biggest pie chart would be phenolics. And that's really where your bioflavonoids, your flavonoids, your isoflavonoids, tannins, those are all in this group. And there's about 2,000 of those total. And that's what gives the plant its color, taste, and flavor. And it's in the phenolics that I think that living soil just destroys every other system. And so we would just say living soil, that I call living soil balanced soil, where it has an existing system to where biological activity is present, and it's self-cycling. And so in this system, what you have is the greatest amount of chemical complexity, and the plant interrelates with that complexity. And I've never met this guy. I see a picture of a dude, so I don't know if it's a dude and a girl or just the dude, but I think it's called Lion Tree Farms, maybe up in Oregon. But he put a number up that was a terp level of 7+ off of a Royal Kush. Now the Royal Kush that was a cut from Mandel, I'm really familiar with, and I've seen it push, almost 30 on the THC, and I've seen it run in the mid 4s, but he hit a 7. And so it really keyed me in that, when we want to define, what is a really killer living soil, you'd be able to measure it really off of your terpene level. Now, a 7 doesn't mean that the customer is going to like it twice as much as a 3.5, because they don't. The numbers alone are misleading, because the way terpenes function is that just because you have a huge quantity of it, it might not be in a direction that the customer appreciates and sees. Minors influence tremendously majors. Hang on a second. Someone just hit me. I'm trying to talk to you over the thing and look at these Q&As. Phenolics is what gives its colors. I probably butchered it, but did I hear you say that right? Flavolics. No, it's phenolics, and that just means it's your flavonoids. And the ability to utilize this information is important, because what it's telling you is that, and someone said, Brandon Russ is killing it on his first year, and he is. He's a great cultivator, and he's got a good system, and he's intelligent with his breeding, where he's breeding things that have high terpene levels originally. So he's running a Gorilla Glue, and he's running some Limarilla. Oh, I'll get some weird backfeed on this, and so his selection process is excellent, and his process is giving him some really high numbers also. So we're going to say that living soil indoor or living soil in outdoor is going to be where you're going to see the greatest amount of terpene accumulation, because you have the most amount of chemical activity that's occurring, and the plant's making it an interrelationship with it. And when we talk, man, they're popping up too many questions. Those are secondary metabolites, and the plant chooses what to prioritize, terps or flavors. Yes, the plant has to prioritize what it wants based off of its needs. And so when we talk about terpenes and cannabinoids, a lot of it is based off of plant stress, but the flavonoids, phenolics, are most definitely based off of that. And you're trying to create
Kevin,
a situation
real quick,
where the plant has some kind of balance between cultivar production and chemovar production. And those two goals have to meet in the middle, because if we're only focusing on the chemotype production, we end up having very low overall plant weight. And so you can't have the two of them optimal, because they both compete. The plant only has so many dollars to spend on what it's trying to do. And so these indicators of a living soil, we typically would say, extremely high numerics in cannabinoids, in terpenes, and I'm not seeing a lot of flavonoid testing. So I don't see anybody testing the phenolics. I'm not getting a flavonoid, bioflavonoid, isoflavonoid profile in my lab reports. We only know that from the mouth. And when you get to consume it is when we can say, hey, the quality of the product from a living soil is better. And it's from that flavonoid production that we receive. Now, you'd think that you would receive it from some of these dialed in lighting systems on the indoor, because it allows you to get such an optimal situation. But when they run the salt-based bottom end, it limits the amount of chemical activity that can occur, because you're only having so much in that container to pull up. So that's where you start to see, these phenomenal living soil indoor beds. And I think I got turned on to my first real good living soil indoor bed was a cat out of Vegas. I want to say his name was like Sin Sticky on IG, but he met me at a conference, and he brought some Skywalker OG that was off of a multi run no till, And it was some of the best OG I'd ever smoked. I mean, the cut was phenomenal too. So the quality of the flower, but the absolute development in it was unbelievable. Where it had just such an unbelievable rich flavor, and the smell was stunning, and he had balanced it out really well. And I didn't see any lab reports on it, but it just destroyed every other bit of OG I smoked at this conference. And I mean destroyed it. And it was from that. And so for us, and what we talk about with living soils, it's what are the benefits we get from living soil is we get typically healthier plants, because the plant has the ability to pull from that relationship in the soil, from its rhizobacteria and endophytic bacteria, the ability to pull and push things that it needs. And then it has enough chemical diversity within that base to be able to steer its direction to fit its needs. And so you are also in cannabis, within this secondary metabolite group, you have alkaloids, and they're just two types of alkaloids, atypical and typical. And some of them are for stimulus, which is typically the typicals, which is like caffeine, nicotine. It's where you'd cocaine. Those are things that we use for those directions as drugs. There's other in the atypicals. There's other substances we use for weight loss and other medical purposes. Bacteria also in fungus has secondary metabolites. And it's the same thing. It's not necessary for their existence, but it allows the plant to have a much better response and ability to steer and tune itself into what it does. And hang on, my son's crying in the background here. So the point we're making here is that when you are trying to take a look at this topic, you have to be really clear about what is it you're trying to achieve. And so sometimes when we want to see insane numbers, we have to be able to say we're going to take in less for the primary metabolite, meaning that if we take a plant and we provide for it everything perfect in the primary system, it doesn't mean we get more in the secondary. The secondary system, ironically, is like a reactionary system to the primary system. So primary metabolites give us the ability to grow the plant, but when we run them at high levels, or even we would say like XSN, we end up getting less numerics. So there was a neat article written by a friend of mine, Christine DeJesus from Galenas, out of Ohio. And so she did an article for Cannabis Business Times on research that she had done. So she has there's a couple of reviewed papers in the article. And she has an organic indoor operation, and I think living soil based. And so she wanted to increase her numbers. And so she did some research, and she found that if she was to get a better level and maybe more specific rhizobacteria, which is just bacteria that lives on the exterior of the root, she would receive better uptake. And she started to do her digging and found that, nutrient levels directly affect production. And I think that they affect production in two ways, where the plant doesn't necessarily metabolize and create the protections based off the fact that there's this excess of goodness that it uses to build, but also that when you're driving high nitrogen into plants, you're creating heavier, thicker, larger leaf material. And I think that when we talk about THC production, it has to be as a THC percentage. And so if we take a plant and this is where earlier in this conversation we went into the foods of the past, where, chemical nutrition of the past, where it focused on plant production, but it didn't focus on the chemovar production. And so once they started to dial that in, what you started to see was a change from leaf into ovule production, where you started to see plants that focus more heavily on their reproductive function versus putting leaf material in to pull photosynthesis in. And so when we remove the plant material, or we reduce it relative to a fixed level of THC, we proportionally have higher THC. So the game is trying to figure out what's this sweet spot. Now, when it comes to cannabinoid production, and when it comes to terp production, we are always obsessed with numbers, because that's what the customer is aware of. And as time goes on, they'll be able to see better what it is they want to buy and why they want to buy it. But for me, I use them as indicators of what's taken place with my process. And so for a cultivator, if you're a cultivator yourself and you're looking at your numbers, you're going to be able to say, hey, is my living soil doing well? Am I getting increased productions in flavonoid and increased production in terps? Because you should have higher flavonoid and higher terpene production in a living media than a chemical media. You typically will have higher THC in the indoor, and I see it more frequent. The highest THC levels I typically see are in extremely long cycle plants that are finished naturally. So years ago, when I was doing a lot of work with the labs, they said that the best sour diesel in California came out of Grass Valley. And so I asked them, I said, and how do you quantify best? Because you're not smoking the sample that you're bringing in, you're just testing it. And they said that the sour diesel in Grass Valley has the highest total cannabinoids, highest THC of any region in the state. And I realized that for sour, it was because it has such a longer flowering cycle, almost like Blue Dream at the time. Mid-November was really when it came out. And the ability for the plant to go through its entire metabolic process and go all the way to the end where you're having very little nutrient uptake because the plant's steering the bacteria to not make the uptake, and the plant's having to rely on cannabinoids as a protection from desiccation, which is what we kind of believe THC does, because no one really knows what THC is there for. We theorize it's there for, an anti-desiccant. We think it's a plant trap for insects. So we have all these theories on it, but we don't know what it really does. So we know that it seems to increase as the stress of the plant rises. And we know that the ability for the plant to go through its whole process is crucial. And if we want to understand that simply, just look at hemp, where if you want to get hemp to fit under the allowable levels, you just pick it early, because the THC really increases in that final last couple weeks of flower. So depending on the cultivar, you might say week 7. If it's something longer like the GMO, which is like 84 days, you're going to be saying like, week 10. So the ability to get a plant to go through its entire process allows us to typically get a higher level of cannabinoids, both THC and overall, because the plant is under stress because it's going through the final stages of its life. And so it let me realize at that time that, some things just shine in certain areas and some things don't. And so for us, in Humboldt, in my location, I came upon a unique circumstance where my farm has is very aggressive on plant height. And so because I have such an unbelievable wind load that moves through the property, it's creating this incredible abiotic stress on the plants. And so when I started using my farm as the test facility to test out cultivars that I was selling, I started to notice a disproportionate change in THC levels from my farm compared to the other farms I released the plants to. And in some case, it might be 10 points. So, I would pull on a creme brulee, I was pulling 22 THC with a 2 THCV. And when I shared the cutout into the public, it was pulling 14. And so we realized that my farm, by virtue of the fact that it's under such struggle to produce because that wind load is so high, that I get an artificially high THC level. So it almost forced me not to use the farm as my sifting spot, because when I would provide the plants to other people, their abiotic stress would be less and they would have lower numbers. They would almost always, though, have higher production numbers in biomass because their location allowed primary metabolism to function better. And someone just threw a question in. How do I tell my custies at the shop no more salt? The argument on this one is you basically have to let them smoke herb that's been built under a biologically driven system. because the problem with salt driven lead systems is that you couldn't have, a more visual flower, because you're tuning the system in to give you optimal lighting for that. It doesn't mean you're getting the most complete bioreactor. It doesn't mean you're getting the most complete spectrum, so the plant's producing factors that we don't know how to measure. It's just that the things that people can measure with their eyes, which is frost and phenomenal ovule production, is very difficult to get around. Like when you look at it in the bag, it looks pretty damn good. And so we're conditioned to go with looks. So I mean, I love smoking this Congo that I have, and when you put it in the bag, it does not look, and it's not bad looking, but it does not look like a 2020 cultivar. It does not have a frost coat that jumping right off it, and it doesn't look like it was exploded from the inside out. And so the only way that you can get a customer who wants to enjoy good grass to be able to make the switch between salt and a bio is really to allow them to check it out. Now, someone's telling me that the questions are piling up, and I'm trying to find where the hell I pulled that up. Let me find Q&A. Where's Q&A? Where's Q&A? How do you
Kevin, if you look at the top where it says chat, there's Q&A is right.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so one of them, hang on a second. No, I have to read these at the same time while I'm talking. So let me just.
No, I got it. Kevin, I got it, buddy. You just go through that, and then when you're ready for a question, I'm here for you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I am. I'm just trying to. It's just that some of these questions are pretty good, and I want to make sure we catch them while we can, because otherwise.
Yeah, Daniel, if you could send those over to the Q&A, that's kind of what I was doing yesterday. That way, it doesn't affect the flow.
So, well, am I supposed to? I don't know if I can type the answer to Q&A and talk at the same time. I'm using my finger. It might be easier if we just.
I'm going to read them to you. Yeah. I'm going to read them to you, sir. And when you're ready for them, and then we're just going to knock them off. But if someone has a question, please put it in the Q&A. Don't put it in the chat so that we don't mess up the flow of when Kevin's speaking, please.
Oh, easy. All right, let's catch some of the Q&A so this way we're chopping on some of this stuff.
Okay.
So the first one I see is from Clarissa Crack.
Actually, we're going to go from the upvote. So Mike, he asked, what type of stressors would you recommend for indoor cultivation to increase the terps?
The stress for indoor cultivation to increase your terps is if you since this is living soil, the idea that you're putting a living soil into the system. So if you replace your bottom end so that you're not running the salt-based model and you're running a living end system, because the fact that the plant is having to work harder to uptake, because we're able to use salts to go right through the root, right through the epidermal layer, right into it, the plant does not have to work to the same degree. And so the work required to pull the nutrients into the plant is a stress. And it's why if you use a foliar program in addition to a living bottom end, you end up having typically greater production levels, because you're able to get around the fact that the plant's having to work so hard to pull it in. So you pull in from the bottom, and then for me, I provide calcium as a foliar on my farm, and I have to, because otherwise I go through a calcium shortage because the wind is so aggressive that what it does is it moves. The calcium's not mobile enough to move at the speed needed to stay in those growing tips, and I end up having a radically reduced production level. And so for you, what you're looking for is a balanced bottom end. And as you're running it, you're going to be able to take a look at your cultivar. So you're going to have to run it a couple times. So you're going to take a plant that you like, and you're going to run it, and you're going to get a baseline number, and you're going to start to steer it. It's not about we have to have more terpenes. It's that we have to have more terpenes that are desirable. And in your process, what you use as bacteria, what you use as fungal, what type of inputs you're running, because there's a million options. There is no one choice. You'll find what works best for that cultivar. And that's the issue, is that we don't have protocols in place for cultivars that say this cultivar under these situations did this. The groups that do that are proprietary indoor groups typically, and that information isn't shared. For us as biological cultivators, I think we share the information a lot more. And what you'll be able to see is, how did that Lion Tree Farms pull a 7 on that Royal? Because what it's indicating is some phenomenal biological activity.
Fantastic, man. We have a lot of questions here, so you want to kind of rapid fire?
Yeah, let's shoot some out.
Yes, sir. All right, so this is from Daniel. Kevin, do you know of any science that shows that more soil microbial life in the soil leads to higher terpene or cannabinoid production by the plant?
Yes, there's studies done on it, and in Christina's work, if you go look at Cannabis Business Times, there's a reference to an article about specific rhizobacteria that they use for uptake. And we know that if we're using enhanced bacterial levels, enhanced fungal levels, we get a higher uptake and we get better production of that. So I don't think that those sciences have been developed to the degree they should. We haven't really focused on being able to create bacteria and fungi that we can use to inoculate to create higher direction levels. And I think that that's where really our science will come in, where we're going to start to be able to identify through soil analysis what is present in the soils that are producing incredibly well and what's not present. And then you'll be able to have a baseline to do your comparison from. Right now, we just know that high-end living soils throw some phenomenal numbers if the plant has the ability. But you have to remember that the higher numbers don't necessarily mean better for the customer in terms of terps. So 7 doesn't mean it's twice as loud as a 3.5. You have to understand that it's just an indicator of incredibly active soil. And that's telling you that you're having an extremely efficient bottom end. The question is, how does that affect your THC levels? Because they're both in the same molecular basket. And so THC would come from my sunlight is phenomenal. I have a drier than normal situation where I'm producing more storage vessels for the cannabinoids to be held. Sheer number of terpenes do not mean more THC. They have the potential to have more because each one of those trike heads are storage vessels. But just because you have a storage vessel doesn't mean it's filled to the brim with just THC. It's filled with terpenes and a full cannabinoid basket. And so the idea of being able to have a drier environment, which creates more storage, and the ability to have a cultivar that has a desire to produce high levels, coupled up with environmental abiotic stresses that force this plant to produce more of this anti-desiccation, is how we steer the THC. And so it's rare that you see extremely high THC and extremely high terps. The grow-off competition a couple of years back, I gave them a White Tahoe cookie cut that I got out of Oregon from Archive. And I'm trying to think who did that cut, but it was just a stunning cut. But it was pushing, 32, 33 in THC, and they were getting it up into the 5s in terms of terpene levels. And that was all from outdoor production. And so that particular plant, due to its genetic makeup, has the potential to give you a 5+ in terps and over 30 in THC. So it's unique. So some plants just do not have the ability to go so high in both. Some plants, it's one or the other. Some plants give you low on both, but because of cofactors, which basically in science means things we don't understand, the high is incredible. And so you're having to take a look and figure out, what are you trying to steer? Right now, enough terps on a sale end is good enough if the THC is high. And so high THC will sell a product much faster than 7% on the terp levels. And I know that people in the panel will say, well, I don't buy my weed that way. I know, but you're all growers. So you're not the ones buying all your grass. It's people who don't grow that typically buy at a store. And for those people, they've been keyed in on percentage numbers. And so just be aware that your numerics are always in competition. If I want bigger, heavier plant, I'm typically always going to get less THC, less terps. There's an equilibrium point where if I go to the left, I get bigger plant. If I go to the right, I get higher chemotype. So our goal is to find that nexus where they both exist so that you get the best size plant and the most chemistry in the plant that you can get at the same time, because now what you've done is you've maximized your total production where you have weight and quality in the same bag. And for us as farmers, if that shit doesn't weigh, we don't get paid. And so for me, it's a tough one sometimes because my farm is so rough on plants production that I almost need, like sometimes like I do a white label, I'll run plants. If I can't run them twice, it's almost a waste of time because the first time I run it, I find out what the environment, what that abiotic stress does to the plant. And then it lets me then the second time I run it, increase the density of the plants, or I can change the planting time so that I can get a plant to be able to have more time to grow. I try not to use higher levels of fertility because for me, when I start to increase too much biomass, I end up having a plant that's too heavy in the wind. And it also creates issues in September when we start to have this moisture change in terms of the dew point drop at night. It brings in pathogenic problems with molds and funguses. So I stay away from trying to drive the plant heavier with nutrition, and I utilize density and I utilize planting time because it works better for my purposes at that location. But I need at least 2 runs to figure it out. The first run, every now and then I hit it and I'm like, it was great. But typically the first run is a test. And then we get numbers and we get weight and production. And then we get cannabinoid production and terps. And we're able to take a look at that and figure out how do we steer it and are we happy with any of it? And if we're happy with some of it, we don't have to worry about that. We just worry about increasing size. And if it's enough size, we worry about how do we start to get the plant to struggle a little bit with its primary metabolites. Because if the plant has optimum primary metabolites, the idea that it would produce optimum secondary metabolites is wrong. The secondary metabolites are produced from this primary process, but in response to need. So the plant just doesn't produce shit because it just produces it. It has to have a desire because you're stealing energy. A good way to look at it is if we're talking about nitrogen fixing legumes. So I put legumes out to do nitrogen fixation on my full term beds. And what I know is that when we measure the plant and we take a look at the plant itself, we say that the plant takes almost 20% of its energy to produce the root nodes, those nodules, to be able to create this nitrogen fixing environment with those legumes in form. And so the plant itself has to use a tremendous amount of energy to produce the ability to get the free nitrogen. So you're having to always give something to get something. There's nothing for free. And so I always call it dollars. It's cannabinoid dollars. It's where are you spending them? Are you spending them and how are you spending them? I think that covered that.
Absolutely, man. Well, I'm over here firing off notes. I actually wanted to ask a question from Instagram. It was thumbed up by the majority of the people on there. And they wanted to know, you personally, Kevin, what cultivars stand out that are new for 2020 that basically all the hype and the hype boys and everything have missed that you think is really something special?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, a lot of the stuff that doesn't get covered heavily it's all in the same families and stuff. And so I had a stunning cookie chem cut I ran that just absolutely shined, but it's cookie chem. So you know, it's stuff that's we would call classic at this point because cookie isn't ancient, but it's not new. I think that some of the GMO hybrids are beautiful. So GMO, people get a little tired of it, but because it's just a heavy, full burning smoke. But I got a beautiful copy from House of Selection. That's from Nick Risden and Josh. and it's a cherry pie to a GMO. And so it comes in a little bit earlier than the GMO, and it has a little more subtlety in that dirty earth that's just phenomenal. The plant that I think I was most impressed with this year, is that I ran that was just absolutely ripped the top of your head off, was a Medellin 111, which was surprising because the Medellin is the plant that does the 40. And so I haven't sent my crop out yet for COA, but I'm fascinated because the smoke coming off of that, when we tested it, we bucked it, dried it. And when I started putting it into the containers to send to the distributor, we burned some of it. And I mean, it absolutely just fucking knocked you out. And the quality was killer. So it's a wedding cake to a Chem D, which is the same thing. It's just really all chems and OG based stuff being shifted out, but it's the selection of what are they choosing for. And that was a rare one where typically when I see things that have excessive THC, high mid 30s and above, the focus was just on that. And on this one, whoever did the selection, it's from Lemonade, but whoever did the selection and chose that particular one chose a phenomenal plant, man. Holy shit, is it some good grass? So I'm still a Chem OG based kind of dude. And I think that those type of things fit a huge portion of the population, and they happen to work really well for me at my location. So I kind of stick with stuff that I like to play with, mostly because it makes me happy when I grow it. If I don't want to smoke it when it's done, I just don't put the same amount of love into it. So I really prefer if I could grow things that I like to smoke, and they have to work for me up on my hill. And cookie morphologically works, and so does fuel. And fuel only works for me, though, really, if I make sure that I maintain a normal level of primary metabolite production. Because if I increase my biological, or I increase my biomass, I get prone to fungal problems. So I learned up the hill that, if I back off my vegetative size, I can get a plant that has no fungal issues, and I get a better chemotype production. And then I can measure that. And this, I get the COAs this season, and I'll get to test them. But the main point when it comes to good pot is that if you're a grower and you can produce flower that has COA numbers that allow you to even be looked at by a distributor, so just accept the fact that what you're producing today might not be what you produce in 2-3 years from now, but you have to be able to produce things that the market wants. And so when you get caught up in trying to educate customers that they should be buying your product, what you have to understand is that when you tell them they don't know what they're doing, you're telling them that they're wrong. And you never tell the customer that they're wrong, because they're not. Their desire is based off of what they understand. So their understanding may be faulty, but it doesn't mean they're wrong. And so this conflict comes in, and it starts to become an argument over who's smarter. And so customers want to come in and argue with bud tenders. Cultivators want to come in and argue with customers. I don't argue with anybody on it. I just accept the fact that if you're in California and you're not over 20, that shit doesn't move to a distributor. If you can get it up to a 30, it flies off the shelf. And if you can get it into 30 plus, mid 30s to 40s, you're talking a really unique product for sale. That doesn't mean it's better grass. It doesn't mean that people are going to enjoy it more. It just means that those numbers are indicators that the customer uses to identify quality. And as time goes on and they're able to get more access to better pot, and meet more craft cultivators, experience more craft production, more biologically driven production, they'll be able to start to swing to farms, because what it'll do is it'll turn into trusting the cultivator. And I think that's what's important, is that you want to have the ability for them to trust you, to say that you're giving them the best product you can, regardless of what it is you're growing. And that's what matters. And so you don't have to get rid of things that don't have value. You just have to, current value, because the numbers are low. You just have to put them to the side in your library, and you weave them back out once you've established some form of market penetration. People always want to come out and do some unique shit to get in the market. And I'm like, dangerous. What you want to do is do things that are proven to get in the market. And then once you're in the market, now you have a relationship with the customer. Now you're able to have a conversation with them and say, hey, we have some stuff that comes in at 15, 16, but it's supernatural. I don't know if you guys ever smoked the underdog cut, but the underdog cut comes in around 14.6. And if it's not one of the most ferocious fuel varieties you've ever smoked in your life, I challenge you to say that it's not. And it's only 14, but it couldn't be a more complete high. It couldn't be a more full in the mouth experience. But if you put the underdog in the market right now, man, it'll get laughed off the table. But once you're able to get people to come in and touch your stuff that's higher numbered, then what you can do now is you can have the conversation and introduce them and say, look, these are the things we produced and these are the things we'd like to introduce. And what it does now is it allows you to put it on the table for introduction and allows the customer to make the introduction and allows the customer to drive the process, not you, because that's not your role. Your role is to produce the product. The customer drives the process because they're the ones that spend the money. So whoever pushes the money is the one who's really pulling the product through the system. So I think that's the way you go about it. You go for things that work well for your environment. There's things that I can't use up my hill. I don't grow them. There's things that I don't really like to grow, and I try to stay away from them. I'm not nothing against Jack Herrera, but I don't like Jack terps. So when I'm growing Jack, it just makes me unhappy because I know that I'm going to put every bit of that in a box and I'm going to unload it and I'm not going to touch any of it. And so there's a disconnection as a cultivator that I don't dig when I grow things I don't like. And that's just me. But we have that ability as cultivators to make some of those choices. And if a company wants me to grow shit I don't like, then I grow it for them. And I just make sure that I grow enough for myself in my home operation, my legal 6 at the farm, legal 6 at my house, so that I can play with what I play with. And that way, at least I'm always getting to do something I like.
Okay, you just mentioned like a cultivar hitting 40%. So I was doing work in Oklahoma last year, and every dispensary had a cultivar that was hitting 40%. How many of those are actually real out there? When you're taking it to the same testing lab you've been using for years, when you are hitting that 40% and maybe hitting a couple percentage points on terpenes, how realistic is that?
I don't see it very often. But I see it more now. Like I have a plant that I have a cookie chem that does like 36 on the THC and hits 42 combined over and over again. So every time it gets run, it's in that same range. So I know that there's a repeatability to it. And you know how testing is, man. It depends on what protocol's used. And are they taking this shit down to 0 moisture level? What's their interpretation of the result? We don't have standardized testing, so it makes it difficult. And everybody's got hot number shit. But the bottom line is, if I consume it, now you got to remember too, like if we talk about, since cannabinoids really are in the terpene family, a long time ago when we didn't have lab stuff, I was somebody who didn't hunt pot for flavor. I wasn't about flavor. I was about the flavor of THC. I like that raw, intense mouth that high THC gave. And I knew that the stuff that ripped the top of your head off, that had this chemical-like aroma and a chemical taste in the mouth from biologically driven grass, was stronger. So I intuitively just said, this must be stronger in the things I like, which are THC. And I would use my nose and my mouth to hunt those cultivars before we got into lab. And so whenever to this day, it's the same thing. When I smoke plants that have extremely high THC levels, it has to have that bitter flavor, almost like an alkaloid. Alkaloids are always bitter. So flavonoids not, but alkaloids are bitter. And when you start to have this bitterness in the flavor of it, I know that I'm experiencing that profile in the mouth, and it absolutely has to stop me moving for a second. I can feel it when I see some of these hot numbers that I smoke, and I'm like, I don't believe it. I'm not getting any of the effect from it. And it's not just because the terpenes aren't there to stare it. It's just that I think that the numbers have been kind of doctored. And so for me, I like to utilize labs that I trust. And I like to utilize the same lab over and over again so I can kind of see a rhythm within the variety. And what happens is when you have a relationship with the lab and you're using to test your stuff, it lets them start to find outlier readings too, where if they see something that doesn't make sense, they retest it. If they see something spike, they retest it. Because then they can let you know, hey, you had a huge jump from this crop to last crop. and it lets you know that they didn't have a lab failure where something occurred to make this result either up or down, but they saw a change, they reran the sample, they have the proof. And so to me, you know, I like good laboratories, labs that have been in business for a while, lab operators that are competent, and they understand that it's interpretation too. It's not so much where every lab has got the same exact criteria and process. But I see this. I saw one the other day online. It was like 41, 42. But I went and bought the bag of that 40 Medellin from the store. I went to the store and bought the bag when it got released, just so I could take a look at this indoor version, so I could take a look and say, all right, what does this 40 look like? And then when I grew it myself, I had no doubt that this shit is absolutely bulletproof in terms of blowing you off your feet, because everybody I smoked it with had to put the joint down. So the power of it was just there. And so we have a confirmation that the lab said it's hot, but we as individuals say it's hot. And so for me, the numbers drive the sale, but if it said 40 and I smoked it and I didn't get high, I wouldn't buy it twice and then I would get a bad review. But the bottom line is that number gets your first sale. And so what you have to be aware of as a cultivator is that when you're driving these ultra high numbers, that's wonderful. But if you smoke it and it's not satisfying to you, it's moot. So you can use the high numbers as indicators that your biological system is working effectively. You can use high numbers to say that your abiotic stresses are high. You can use high numbers to say that your bacteria delivery is high. But that doesn't mean that the quality of effect to the individual is high. That has to be the evaluation at the end of the crop where you go, hey, this particular cultivar did well or did not do well in my system. It was not the right cultivar for me. And we know that from growing enough stuff similarly and having enough individuals that grow the same thing, and you figure out who did the best job. And a lot of times, even if it's all the same exact inputs, all variables held constant except location, the terroir, the abiotic stress that occurs from that was the influence that made it shine in that location. And that's where, to me, as we start to get much more evolved in what we do, it allows us the ability to share this information among craft cultivators, because, like I said, commercial cultivators are not going to share this information. They are not going to give you this type of data. They're not going to give you the understanding, because to them, every competitive advantage is a massive one. And for us, the competitive advantage is that we work on competitive exclusion, where as a culture, as a group of people, we can fight to work on a problem. And what that'll do is that'll start to give us the information we need of how did Brandon get such a high number on his Gorilla or whatever, Limarilla, right?
Limarilla.
So, yeah, how did he get such a hot number on it? Because part of it's from Gene's Lime, which is just absolutely a terp monster. And Gorilla Glue is a stunning chassis. So if you can take Gorilla Glue and use it as a base and then apply modern terps to it, modern meaning not overly utilized, not overly accessible. So some of Gene's stuff is pretty unique, and like he hasn't released a ton of stock as stock. He makes you go and do it into seed. And so a lot of people who work with his lines, they're in the craft level. You don't see his products moving through commercial facilities because he hasn't given them the cut. They have to actually go do the work. And a lot of them, it's going to take a minute. But for us in craft work, our ability to be able to work together in some capacity is what makes us really a stronger unit. And so once we say, hey, I'll get the COA, and once I do, I'll hit you up and I'll let you know what that number is on that Medellin. But it was so fucking
we'd love to know.
In the truck. We had to I had to put the joint down for a minute and looked at the person next to me in the car, and I said, holy shit. And it was just brutal. And the indoor version was stunning, but the outdoor version had a radically different flavor. So my flavonoid, my phenols, those components that make outdoor cultivation superior for me, what I like, that thick, full, rich in the mouth flavor, that oily, paint your mouth, you can't spit that shit out. It just killed the indoor there. But I haven't run the numbers, and when I do, I'll be able to compare them, because I know that the cut's pulling a consistent, 38 to 40 in testing. We'll see where we hit with the out. And as long as I have a good number, I'm okay. I'm not trying to compete with who has the greatest THC level with the cultivar. What I want to be able to do is find the balance where my THC level is high, my terpene levels are high enough in the direction that makes a quality of experience, and I have good flavonoid production so that the mouth is good.
Well said, man. For a lot of you guys out there that are new to living soil or just new to farming cannabis in general, this gentleman's lecture right here is saving you potentially years of a learning curve. Just to understand the market and the way that he's describing things today, and a lot of the other stuff that he has out on YouTube will save you a tremendous amount of time if you're trying to get into the commercial space. Real quick here, Kevin, how are you picking the CBD males? Somebody, again, wanted to ask that from our Instagram poll. So just real quick on that one, I know you were focused on THC, but that was the second highest request.
Oh yeah, no worries. I do the same thing that when I'm steering cannabinoids, what I'm doing is I'm doing predicative testing. So that just means that I'm taking the seeds of the plants that I'm working with, and I grow them out for a couple weeks till I get a plant, 10, 12 inches tall. It lets me take the top 3-4 inches of the plant and send it into the lab for early testing. That early testing lets me get rid of anything that has low numbers. But for THC production and CBD production, there's a key element you want to look at, and that's CBG. And so CBG is the pot that all the other cannabinoids are basically cooked from. And so when I take a look at a plant and it has, say we're looking at 100 plants, and we find a few of them that have just disproportionate CBD or THC numbers early in production, in its growth state, I take a look at those, and I also look at the amount of CBG present as a ratio towards that number. Because if I see a very high number in early predicative, but I see almost no CBG, what I know is that I've pinned out the amount of CBD or THC that's going to come out of it. So I know that it might be higher in early veg, but I haven't hit its full potential because I still have a chunk of CBG remaining. So I look for things that have disproportionately high numbers compared to their brothers and sisters. And then I look for the ones that have high CBG remaining, because I know that means that once I dial in my production, once I get my abiotic stress up, once I get my biological delivery improved, what I'll be able to have is an even greater number. And so that allowed us to work. So what I did was I was involved in these CBD projects, but I was helping individuals create their own seed lines because a lot of the people in the community didn't have grid power. So a lot of the older people who wanted to work with CBD for medicinal purposes for themselves, they didn't have year-round grid power, which allowed them to run moms. So they were traditional seed users. And so these seed users, they were getting screwed because I was only producing clones for them. And I was giving the clones away, but they couldn't hold the clone. So what I did is I said, listen, because I had the ability, we had a really good business, and I had such a good relationship with the lab, and Pure Analytics was the lab that I used at the time, and they were so helpful in what I did, was we were able to start to utilize the lab tools to help people create their own breeding lines to steer cannabinoid production. And like I said, when we first got into it, everything was around 5 or 6%, and within a year and a half, there was probably 90 to 100 different cultivars in the triangle that were pushing 20. And it was from this method where we would take a look at early production and then take a look at disproportionate CBG levels remaining and take those plants out and use those in the breeding process. And so we were only steering for cannabinoids. We weren't worrying about morphological traits or any other factor. Once we were able to get a disproportionate skewing of CBD or THC and CBG into a breeding population, I would then breed those to start to try to concentrate those traits. And once we had a concentration where we could lift the levels up to say 12, 13% CBD, now we could go through that population and find the cultivar. So what I was hunting was chemovar first. I didn't hunt cultivar first. I hunted chemovar first. And that let me steer the direction. And then once we had a population that we knew the numbers were good pretty consistently, we then went after the cultivar. And then we could then test the cultivars that we kept as the winners and find out what the ratios were. And it allowed us to be able to create seed lines for people privately that needed the ability to be able to put seed out and get a pretty reliable quantity of cannabis in the range they desired. And it's just a wonderful tool.
Fantastic, man. I'm listening to you, sir, and I am writing pages of notes. So I appreciate that.
No worries, man. I'm grateful to be here.
Yeah, well, this is a dream come true for a lot of us that have been trying to get education around first our goal was here in Denver, then the country, and now that the fact that we're doing this worldwide. So hats off to everybody. Next question from Jacob. Have you found any specific lighting spectrum that boosts THC production?
You know, for me, all the work that we did prior on indoor was all through Helio, and they had the data. But really what you're going to find is it's in your like 400 to 420 blues and in the UV. And so that ability, because that's going to be second metabolite production. So if I can focus on second metabolite production instead of primary metabolite production, then, and I'm using that 4 to 420 and I'm using UV, I'm going to achieve a higher level. If you're doing it indoor, the problem is that when you're focusing on that, you're not focusing on biomass production. So you're going to get less weight, which is going to kill your rate of investment. Your return on investment is going to get smashed. And so what I think of like a lot of the lighting companies, they recommend is that you have like a multi-stage operation where you're vegetating in one space, you're getting deep into production in another, and you're either changing the light through switching or you're changing the space, and you're going after secondary metabolite production later in the plant's cycle. So we work on healthy juvenile, we work on healthy adult, and then when we get it into that stage of finish, we start to bring in more of that 420 and more of that UV, and it increases it. But for me, like I don't do any indoor production at all anymore. I did so much of it so long ago that I got burned out on it, and I just really want to be outside under the full sun. And so for me, the ability to have a good full sun production where you're catching a strong, intense charge, at least 6-7 hours a day of it, and you're going to have the plant catch enough balanced light through it. We know that the sun changes spectra through its cycle due to that angle of inclination, and that's what lighting systems are really built off of. Is it catching early spring sun? Is it catching full summer sun? Is it catching end of fall sun? Because the metabolite production is influenced tremendously by that spectra. The sun, it isn't changing in its profile. It's just changing because it's moving through the atmosphere. And so for indoor growers, if you're using biologically driven bottom ends, then you're able to get the plant to have the flavonoid production that you're seeking, and you're able to get terpene levels that you're seeking. And if we can work on getting a plant big enough in the system to where it's making money, you can then focus on that 4 to 420 and then UV. And that's where you're going to see secondary metabolites kind of light up.
Yes, sir. Next question is from Adam. Mr. Jodrey, regarding living soil from the home grower, yesterday's presentations, Dr. Ingham's in particular, were incredibly detailed. Yet I left feeling like I was much of what was discussed was way over my head and inaccessible to the average home grower. I realize the complexity of this process and do not mean to demean the expert knowledge of those like yourself and Dr. Ingham. But is there any way to simplify the process of building and maintaining a living soil for the home grower? Sorry, that was a long one.
That's okay. No, I'd say yes. And the first thing is like I'm definitely not in Elaine's category. You got to understand that I'm not a chemist and I'm not a living soil technician. I'm somebody I'm like you. I'm learning about living soil, and I'm learning about how do you build a healthy rhizosphere for your plants. And so what what I've noticed is that, some of the simplest systems, for biological driven stuff is really like earth boxes. And so Elaine doesn't like the earth box too much because she doesn't see anaerobic delivery. But a lot of that is because anaerobic and aerobic are in ranges of ppm. What's the parts per million of oxygen? And so there's this gray area between what we would consider anaerobic and aerobic. But for someone who wants to mess around with biologically driven systems, the first thing is start as easy as possible. Make it really simple. And if you're only able to do a 4x4 bed of it, that's fine. It's not a competition. That's the whole point about biologically driven systems is you're not competing with anybody. You're trying to create really good cannabis for you. And if it's a business, then you have some different considerations. And if it is a business, then what you want to do is bring in a consultant. And you want to bring in somebody who's absolutely running this system in real life, not someone who saw it on TV or they read about it on IG, somebody who's running this shit. Because the complexity of it and the ability to be able to take soil analysis and use microscopes to figure out what is your fungal levels and what's your bacteria, like where are you at with the living cycle, it's huge. And so for me, I think the best thing you can do to start out with this stuff is to go to something simple like an earth box, where you're using streptomyces driven uptake. You're using, something that's a EM1 inoculant, maybe applied through Grokashi. That was a product that, Alan Atkinson produces. There's other Bokashi, but Grokashi is just a little bit more loaded. And I just had phenomenal results with it for people who wanted to grow their own biologically driven cannabis. And once you start to be able to work on biologically driven cannabis, you start to understand the cycle of how there's a slow beginning, the microbial populations increase, the plant builds its relationship, it starts to have incredible production. And as they start to consume the nutrients in these containers, you start to see the plant have need. You start to be able to anticipate the need so that you're keeping the plant in this stable state of production, but utilizing organic methodologies, which just give you better in the mouth plant. And I think that's the first part, is that none of us are going to jump in and be Elaine, where you had, some of the people on the panel, they're brilliant soil people. And the thing is that they're giving you a massive top-down view. And what you want to do is don't get overwhelmed by it. Go to the bottom of that view and start where you can. And then what it does, it allows you to start to be able to understand the rhythm of biological production. And once you get a feel for, and you might fail, who cares? You might kill a few plants. You should. If you're not killing something, you're not growing. And
well said.
And that's real. Yeah, it's real. You got to be making some mistakes. It's okay. Just take your time and work through the process and record the process so that you can leave a trail of breadcrumbs to get back to the success that you might find. Because when you do find it, you will find it. And when you have it, you want to be able to make sure you can repeat it. And then from there, you can get deeper and deeper into this cycle of how do we create a true, recycling system where all the waste products that are coming from the plant are being returned to the bed itself and being utilized. And so there's just understanding how to water correctly is an incredible problem with these biological systems, because of the way the dry spots are and how that affects your living soil biology, because it creates dead zones. So just start as small as possible and start as easy as possible, and just allow the beauty of not being in control to drive you. Chemical operations are phenomenal if you're a control freak, because it lets you control every single aspect. But it's the lack of control in biologically driven systems that brings out what I call the intangible, the quality that you can't create on your own, the one that has to come from something more complex than your understanding. And once you experience it, once you smoke it the first time, once your friends smoke it, it's over. And that from that point forward, you're hooked, and your friends will be hooked too, because they'll all realize, because most of us that are older, like I'm in my mid 50s, I'm 55. We all started out originally, like back in the 70s, growing outdoor in the backyard into good East Coast loam. And then indoor kicks in, and we all go indoor and we go rock wool, chemical, CO2, we're pushing. and we're all happy with what we're doing. But I remember that I used to go buy a blueberry from a buddy of mine who ran a small organic indoor operation, and I used to pay him $400 an ounce for that weed because it was better than mine, and I was making more money than him. I was selling way more weed, but he had better pot, and I couldn't deny it. Like, there was just no fucking denying that was better. And so what it did is it really made me understand that down the road where I wanted to be was within biologically driven cultivation, because I wasn't ever desiring to be the biggest cultivator. I just wanted to grow really good pot. It wasn't a competition. It was about producing something that you were proud of, that you would love to smoke yourself, and that you'd hope that the people who get their hands on it can enjoy it the same way. And that's a different type of relationship with customers than just, I'm giving you this. It's about, I'm giving you a piece of me. And there's a intimacy to that I think craft cultivators share. And it's not just craft cultivators, it's craft individuals in anything. If you buy a well-made pair of shoes, if you buy a good belt, if you buy a craft hat, it just fits better. It wears different. It lets you understand someone took more time to do so. And in our society, we got rid of a lot of those habits. We become very IKEA-like, where it's quick to put together and quick to throw out. And that's not our situation. We're not in that world. We're in an experience world where, as we go forward and people have a chance to really experience good grass, you can't deny that biologically driven pot is better in the mouth.
Absolutely. I mean, I was banking my entire career just a few years ago on learning this process because I just couldn't outcompete the dispensaries on price. And if I'm really being real with myself, my peers were starting to outshine and outperform me. So it really is the microbial world that, if you understand that, you're going to be able to take your game to the next level.
Guaranteed.
Yeah. So for you guys out, in the legal world, especially with Biden coming in, where do you see things moving in the next 5 years as far as cannabis distribution?
That's interesting. I still think federal legalization or federal anything that's going to allow us to move from the U.S. out of the U.S., that's down the road. But I know that right now, you only have probably, 6, 7 states maybe that don't have some form of medical.
Right.
And so, there's only a few places in the Midwest and in the South that are really like dead zones. And the rest of the U.S. is either medical or legal, like recreational. And so I think that as we go forward, you'll start to see agreements between states for movement. And hopefully, the Fed, I never have any faith in the Fed, because you remember the Fed wants to get paid. Yeah. And so the question is, how do we move cannabis from California to New York without the Fed getting their hand on it, because it's now moving from border to border? So the states will create arrangements and agreements, but it's almost like in California, if you're a distributor and you're moving cannabis and you're down by the San Diego border, you can get pulled over by the Border Patrol and have your cannabis seized because they're federal agents. And within 100 miles of the border of another country, you have these zones that are considered like federal law enforcement zones. And it allows the Fed to pick you up and they keep your weed. So California distributors are getting jacked by federal agents within that 100-mile strip of the Mexican border. So, that's my fear. And that's what really I think people don't catch, is that the reason why big companies haven't got into cannabis is because the Fed, they don't trust the Fed either. And what they know is that if they build this massive operation, the Fed can come in and seize it and cost them financial loss. So they're big enough as companies to where they're not worrying about getting in first. When they get in the room, you're not going to have any choice but to see them here, because they're going to be that big. They just have to wait until the risk is low. And so for us, the first thing I think you have to work on really is develop your reputation in the state that you're in. So if you're a cultivator, develop the reputation through sales of your product, through dispensaries, through good relationship with distributors. And what that'll do is that'll start to get you to where you have a known brand that is able to be researched. Someone can look you up online. They can find a review. There's people who demand your product. Other distributors see your product moving quickly. They want to do work with you. Don't be afraid to do collaboration projects. If someone asks you, you want to do a collab and they're a solid operator, go ahead and do joint collaborations. Start to use every tool you can to get yourself so that you're out there. What people do is they put all their shit on IG and on Facebook and all this fucking public social media as if the customer is on that shit looking at your weed. Those are platforms for us to kind of communicate. But your customer, the majority of people that buy grass are not living online. They're at work all day. So they go to work, they go to the dispensary, they say, hey, I want to buy a bag of grass. This is where the education with bud tenders is essential, to where we start to develop common language, common understanding, so that they have an ability to take your product and actually explain to people what makes it good. And it then allows the customer to be able to make decisions based off of a much more comprehensive understanding of the product. And so it's going to be nonstop. If you got into herb to make money, you got in about 10 years too late. If you got into herb to make like quality of life, then you're at the perfect time, because you can cultivate without fear of being dragged off to the joint. So it allows you to be able to build a long-term model, where our model before was really, I used to call it smash and grab, where, we'd come in, light up buildings, and if we could run it once or twice, we made all the money we needed, we could shut it down. Now it's the opposite. Now you're trying to create some form of long-term vehicle to move your brand into the future. And for craft cultivators, it's about trying to give them the best product you can, and understanding that there's a line between chemotype and cultivar. So the plant and the chemistry, you have to find the nexus. It might be the greatest THC level ever recorded, but if they're not going to give you 3 times the price and it's 3 times less weight, you didn't make any money. So you have to kind of rein in your emotional component so that you can see the reality of what we need to do now is survive. What we need to do is have lectures like these, where we're sharing information, and we're sharing it to people who need the information from people who are succeeding with the information. So what you're getting is reviewed, proven data to help you move forward. You do not see this in the normal professional cultivation world. It's an anomaly. Our world is still extremely different than most, because we really down deep love weed. And because of that, for most of us, it makes you a little less aggressive to other people, and you want to see people do well. You want to see a better situation. You have a desire to see a improved world. And that's your ethos. All those things shine in your flower when you present it. And the ability to stay focused on that is what you need to right now. But, we're talking at least 5 years minimum before anything gets moved around. I don't care what Biden and Kamala Harris said. And I'm not a pro-Trump or pro-Biden. I think they're both corrupt. Yes. I just know that. Yes. I just know that when you are the architect of the drug war, which is Biden, and your Kamala, who put people in prison for herb and then kept them there for longer amounts of time to extract the labor from them, it's hard for me to listen to them telling me that they have an understanding now about my needs, because I don't think they were stupid back then. I think that what they understood was, just like we're trying to understand THC production, they were trying to understand, how do we make money off the criminal justice system? So when that's your foundation, it's hard for me to suddenly believe you are suddenly a new, different person, because now you're in a different position. When you were in the position you were in, you were a prick. And I think you're going to be a prick again. So I'd say focus on what you're doing in the state you're in. Don't worry about what's going on outside your state. Just be aware of what's occurring, so you can understand how each state has their own operational situations. Be aware of guidelines that'll have to be followed once this does become federally in a control system, to where you're going to have certain manufacturing standards, and take a look to figure out how will that impact you now. So this way, if you're going to build a facility, you make sure that the facility is going to be able to be converted into something that will work in the future, and not be a dinosaur you have to bury and build fresh. For us that are doing the craft work, I think it's most important that you create these relationships with other craft cultivators so that you can all work together to kind of figure out, how do we shine? My situation is radically different than my neighbors because I'm in a wind tunnel. So for me, I don't have to compete with my neighbor because I can't. They get bigger plants. They get more weight. I get a more interesting, to me, it's interesting because I get such a diverse cannabinoid profile and I get extreme cannabinoids. So for me, it works in that direction, but my neighbor has bigger plants. What we do is we can talk and I can find things that work for him as bigger plants, and he can find things for me that they think work well on chemotyping, so that we can always share material. You have an ability to utilize each other's skill sets. And I think that's what's most important, is to build the relationship that we're all cannabis cultivators regardless of method. And if you're a small cultivator, don't be afraid to work with other individuals if you get a good feel for them. And if you feel desperate, go back home and sit down for a minute and don't do anything, because desperation is always what leads you into shit decisions.
Man, I appreciate you kind of giving a sprinkle of that OG mentor on top of what you're presenting today. I think a lot of people, they never experience some of the things that I feel like some of us on the live today I have experienced, especially when you're talking about, I had a lot of friends. I grew up in Georgia that, because of the color of my skin, I got away with a lot of the stuff that my friends actually got locked up for. And we were at the same spot. We should have been charged with the same stuff. And so it was just nice to hear you mention that a little bit. This next question. Real, yeah, it is real. And I don't think a lot of people will truly understand that. They might read a magazine or something.
The drug war was built to enslave specific groups of people. And what took place over time was that we all became much more similar when the middle class was removed financially. And so now what you're seeing is an awareness in the white population about what took place, because they're being abused now financially. And they're like, wait a minute, I'm being abused. And now it lets you take a look and go, wow, we abused these other groups for money. We created a prison system for money. The drug war was about money. None of this had anything to do with anything good for people other than the individuals who own privatized prisons. And so once you realize that, you go, wait a second, I got you. And so much of the stigmas were put on, and it really screwed up a lot of shit. And I think that herb is one of the things that allows people to find that common middle, and we need it. We need to be able to see each other as participants together in a thing. And what it does, it allows us to share this information, and you do the best you can, and you try to support each other the best you can, and you create a situation where the customer sees the culture of cannabis production as something that's fun, it's something that's cool, something that's enjoyable, not just some lab bullshit, because that doesn't turn people on. But the idea that you're getting to do what you like to do and have some kind of freedom, if they can connect that sense to the cannabis, it's the same thing of Nike. Nike doesn't show you shoes. They show you people winning, because Nike's the winged goddess of victory. That's who she really is. So they're selling you the winged goddess of victory, not a shoe. And because of it, they just smashed every other shoe business, because don't tell me they're better shoes. The same damn sneaker.
Better storytelling.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what we need to work on, is our storytelling. And it's just really about the story of no pity. I don't want any fucking pity at all about how our lives got changed from legalization, because no one gives a shit. Everybody's life got changed from some traumatic event. Explain your struggle to someone who lost their fucking business to COVID. They're going to be like, yeah, nice. I'm glad you struggled making all that money. What we want to talk about is the struggle to be able to be good farmers and learn how to do land stewardship in an era where that is not the occurrence. It's the opposite. We're environmental degraders, where we favor large ag. So for all of us as these small craft cultivator groups, it's really about, getting together mentally so that we're on the same page of me talking shit about you doesn't benefit me. It just makes us all look bad. And what it does, it allows us to be able to create a culture where customers be like, damn, I want to smoke weed, but I want to, when I smoke it, I want to feel like I'm Brian. I want to feel like I'm somebody who lives that life, and because it's escapism and it's healthy escapism. And I think that cannabis, aside of all its incredible other properties, it's not bad to escape from your shitty life once in a while and not have any detrimental side effects. And so cannabis allows you to take a shitty day and make it nice, and it lets you take a nice day and make it better, and it lets you take a better day and make it best. And not many products do that.
Yeah, my whole life I feel like it's definitely improved things. And I used to get pumped full of Adderall and all of these really speed. It was like legal speed. So
yeah.
It's just fantastic that, you're in a lot of our eyes, especially I guess from more of my peers, you've been teaching us since it was illegal to do what we're doing, where we still had anxiety every time we were pulling down a harvest. So for a lot of the viewers today, they're going to be able to also have this mentorship in a way from you. 2.5 hours to listen to you talk, sir, is just unbelievable. So
Man,
we
so
really
much.
appreciate it.
Let's jump. It's been a pleasure. And you got any more questions you want to ask? What we got?
Oh yeah, man, there's a ton. That's why I didn't want to take up too much, but I wanted you to know, man, this really is something special, because I don't think a lot of people realized how before everything became accepted, this is really how we would learn from one another. Is there'd be some kind of mentor or some kind of OG that would pass on information, a lot of information on how to keep us out of prison, how to move packs without tipping off the police. I mean, there were a lot of things that we had to learn. You guys don't have to learn any of that. You can just focus on cultivation, keep your skill set up, and never have to experience what we lovingly always called the bubble guts when we would take down and move product. Let's go with Theo here. He's asking, are you starting to see more cultivars selected and bred under LEDs?
Yes, because the LED lighting systems are our future, due to the fact that you're getting, especially now in California, you're going to see it because they're going to mandate a certain level of efficiency for a lighting fixture. And so, and the funny thing is, it'll be the same issue we had when we went from mogul socket to DE, and then from DE into CMH, and then from CMH into LED, is that when we're, and then full sun, when we're choosing the cultivar, its response to the stress is what we see in the end product. And so when we're choosing it, we choose it to fit our system. And so a good tip to understand is that if you're getting a variety from someone that did something, you have to ask them, give me your production methodology so I understand how you achieve those numbers, or the yield amount, or this flavonoid profile, because then what it'll do is it'll help you match that cultivar to your system. And if it was selected in a radically different situation, then you need to do a small test run on it to see, does it give you the same quality of effect? Is it giving you the same experience that you want? Does it give you the numbers? But the new technologies, as they are adapted, all work will be reflected from that. And down the road, we'll be talking about mogul socket lights like there was something in the dinosaur age. But you're seeing the LED, and especially now the LEDs are coming down in price. When we first messed around with LEDs, those Helio Spectres I played with, they were like $15,000 a plate. For real, $15,000 a plate.
Yeah, I remember the plasmas. The lady told me at an Indo Expo that we weren't even allowed to purchase them. We had to lease them. That's how expensive they were.
Yes, because the plasma technology was so incredible that you could create UV. And all you had to do was basically take the jacket off of a metal halide and you had UV. It's just that, the direction that's steered. And so for me, I only run, my flower outdoor. And so for me, what I need to be able to see is, I see people do work inside, and that gives me an idea of what the profile is like under that situation, the cannabinoid levels under that situation, the growth situation under that context. But then I put it outside and I see what it does for me, and it does it work or does it not? And so you have to constantly test. And I think that what people want to do is they just want to rush into something where I grab my plants, this is what we're going to run. And really, it's this never-ending process of sifting, to where you're constantly running new stock all the time in small tests to find out, does it work for you, and does it shine, and does it reflect what you're trying to put out? And when it does, you hold that in your library. So it might take you a while to build a library. And ideally, it should take you a while, because what it means is that you actually built your own library. You didn't just inherit it from someone else. You selected and chose things that worked optimally for your circumstances. Because once you build your operation, you shouldn't be flipping lights every year. You make a decision, you run with it. And if I was going to light a facility right now, I'd only light it into lead, because I know that's where all the research and development work is occurring. So I would try to find who had the best lead driver, who's got the best chipset, and who's got the best warranty and reliability on service. So this way, what you have is some ability to fix these things when they go out. And then you run that until new technology supersedes it to the point that you have to change. But I wouldn't ever go anything into backwards production, just because you're, especially in California, you're going to get mandated with electrical consumption that's going to just basically beat you to death. So LED is most definitely our right now present, and in the near future. And I look forward to see what comes next. But for me, it's just more fascination. I mean, I can't help but look at it and study it, but I don't care what light they created. I'm still cooking herb outdoor.
Amen. I wish I could.
Yeah, no, we're lucky out here. We got the right climate, you know?
Yeah, an outlier state for sure with that. Hey, Alex wants to know, have you heard of the sun on demand plasma light? And if so, what is your opinion on it?
I haven't heard of the sun on demand plasma light. I was hanging out with Jeff Lowenfels, and he broke out some supersonic plasma light that he turned it on, and basically it blew the whole room white. Like it was.
That's the light I was. Yeah, that was the light I was talking about. It's like a gentleman and a woman in charge of it. I forget their names.
Yeah, there was an Asian brother. I can't remember his name. Hella nice guy.
Very nice. Very knowledgeable.
Yeah, and the light was unbelievable. But the bottom line is, you know, the what I recommend when you buy products is you buy things that have really good customer service. So are they going to be, it's not that there's not some killer tech, but is it going to be present in a year? Because because you're the smartest guy in the room doesn't mean your product's going to sell. And it doesn't mean you're going to stay in business. Business doesn't reflect smartest always. It reflects other realities. And best sometimes doesn't fit in that either. It's really what's the best compromise. And the best compromise, I think, for cultivators is find a product that has a business that is going to stay in business. If you buy the products and the business goes out of business, you have a bunch of shit you can't service. And what's the point? So to me, I always look for companies that are going to be around for a minute. They have a longevity component that I need to see possible. And that way, what it does, it allows me to make an investment. So when I lay out projects for people, that's what I look at. I say, okay, what company has these characteristics? And so we'll use Fluence for an example, because of our nursery facility and the Mixolites are all Fluence. Fluence is they got bought by Osram. So Osram creates the chipsets for most of these companies, but Osram directly tied into Fluence. The idea that Fluence is going to go out of business anytime soon is kind of moot once you have one of the major chip manufacturers in the world owning them. So does it mean that Fluence is the best light? No. There's other excellent lighting systems. It's just that I know that the odds of Fluence going out of business anytime soon is pretty low. And that's what we need to do, is make sure that we're not trying to be so unique that there's no way to replicate it down the road. So, you know, that trendy and cool is nice, but my lawyer used to always tell me, you want to be the leading edge, not the bleeding edge.
This is why, experience trumps a lot of things in life. And just thinking of that kind of process, I know when I was growing commercially here in Colorado, we would have a lot of the lights bust and break. And it was a constant. So a lot of lighting has changed. But at the same time, I know our facility wasn't thinking about customer service from the brand. We only thought about the cheapest light that we could get from China.
Totally. And as we go forward, though, you won't be able to. Like I said, in California, we're having these electrical demands where they're saying, you know, you're using too much grid. You're going to be mandated to having a certain amount of efficiency per watt.
Yeah.
And so the companies that are, you know, doing traditional HID lighting, they'll work on creating a more efficient system. But the bottom line is they're already less efficient than LEDs. So it LEDs can become more efficient. So I just see the trends shifting and moving. And main point is, like I said, get a company that's going to be there, that has a good scientific team to help you lay out your space. That's where Gavita was really successful as a business, and that you didn't just buy the light, you could actually contact them and they would lay out your grids. So you'd be able to understand how to properly light the space, how to control it so that you had beautiful, even footprint over the entire facility, not just over the canopy itself. So this way, no matter what you did in that space, the lighting levels were even and you had no hot spots, which really create undesirable circumstances where the plants are either overly lit, underlit, or the metabolism is too high or too low.
Well, you kind of threw me through a loop when you answered that, man, because I didn't think that you were going to go there, but that's exactly what you would need. I mean, you need to obviously focus on a brand name that has customer service that you know is going to be there for you, especially at the larger commercials facilities. All right, Jacob wants to know, sir, what would be an old school cultivar that you had the chance to bring back to market regardless of market demand?
Oh shit! You know what I really like, man, is it's funny, but I love that. If I'm going to bring it to market, it has to have a market demand, or what's the point? No one's gonna want to buy it, right? Right. So there's things that for you that are killer. I love some of the old hazes, but like when I was playing with the hazes, I went on a haze quest for a couple years, and I got caught up in these 140-day cycles because I was just like, if you're beginning flower at day 70 of the cycle, now you're in the right world. And the problem is that you can't make a dime off that shit because the cycle's so long. But I like stuff like the Hog's Breath from the 90s. I love that garlic skunk, and I think that laying that back into the market and then throwing some other things into it to bring the funky skunky garlic nasty out of it and weave it in would be wonderful. I was working on that skunk project, and then I got ill a couple years back, and it just really threw me into a health and time deficit. And so I ended up licensing out all the plants to another operation so that they had the ability to go forward and do the rest of the project, because I just didn't have the time. And after I got ill, I was just really fatigued, man. It took me like 2 years to come back. And sometimes, life just kicks you in the balls, and that was one of those times. But yeah, I love all the burnt rubbers, and I love the acrid piss skunks. Stuff that if a lot of it's nostalgia. It reminds me of when I was younger, and those things were beautiful then. I was just smoking on I got the original bubble gum out of Indiana.
Yeah, so, I grew that for a while.
Oh my gosh, man! I got the original cut, and I grew it out in my yard this year so I could get a chance to show my kid and stuff and my family, like, this is what bubble gum is. And it was like, they didn't know what trading card gum was because they don't have gum in trading cards anymore. But when I was a kid and you got the little pack of trading cards, there was always a flat piece of gum in the middle. And that's what bubble gum smelled like, was that artificial powdered sugary
big league chew kind of thing.
Yeah, super gum. Chemical gum. And it just reeked, and it was so incredible. And they were just like, holy shit. And it has a really nice, fruit soft smoke. But the smell on it is supernatural, and it's just so attractive because people aren't used to seeing it anymore. And so it's things like that they're from the dawn, where a lot of the newer smokers, they heard about it from their family, or they might have remembered smelling it in their uncle's car when they got in the car. Their uncle picked them up at school, and they were like, damn, Uncle, what's in that car? He's like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I like to see come back, just because they were stunning back then. And all we need to do now really is just, and it's the truth, is you got to increase your production on THC. And so whatever numbers they might have reached back in the 90s, we know we can add probably 7-8 points to it minimum, just through lighting technology improvements, we can increase flavonoid through our biologic delivery. If we find the right location for those plants and get the abiotic stresses up. So we'll be able to get them into a numerically marketable range, and then allow people to be able to experience some of the stuff that really made us love weed. So that this way you can, it's kind of like taking, traditional grape and reintroducing it. Like I was drinking some Malbec the other night, which is one of the main components of Bordeaux. So if it's in that region, Malbec is one of the grapes used, but it's an old grape. And I was drinking a good bottle of Malbec. It got really popular in Argentina. And
that's like in Mendoza, right?
It was like an old flavor. So it was something that was just, I would say, a traditional. And it was nice because it lets you see where we were and where, that you need 2 points to determine an end point. So if we have 2 points, we can create a line. It'll send us out in a direction. And if we know where we were and where we are, we should be able to see where we're going. And the ability to take some of these older varieties and bring them out and then use our improved knowledge of biological production where we're tailoring it, and the ability for individuals who are doing a lot of the indoor in places that you can't do outdoor, but they're running biological systems. So a biologically driven bottom end, a room that has the ability to keep your VPD straight beautifully so that the plant's able to produce its cultivar potential, and then proper lighting to influence chemotype. Man, you're gonna see some of these old varieties shine, and now TC is going to scrub them up because a lot of this shit is carrying pathogenic problems that we didn't really realize we're changing it. So when you take a look at a lot of these virus issues, all of a sudden you have very low terpene levels, very low cannabinoid levels, just overall, no quality of experience. And we say that it's old and it's too many generations from clone, but really we know that when we culture it, it's viral issues, because you can see the virus crawl out of the material into the agar solution. So once we scrub a lot of this old stuff up, what we have is now new clean material that we can then say, okay, this is what it was when it was new. And with our understanding of how to optimize development, we can move it into a range where it's sellable. And then once people buy it and consume it, it begins the relationship. And I think that that's our main thing, is to be able to create, anywhere in the US, that there's craft cultivators that exist in every community. And when people go to the dispensary, I hope my goal in life really is to see people come to the dispensaries or storefronts or whatever we call it and say, hey, what do you got that's from craft farms? And what it does then is it allows them to be able to go through the craft farms and they can ask, well, who does the good gas? Who does the good fruits? Who does the good fuels? Who does the good earths? Where do I get the good florals from? And those certain farms will focus and shine in those categories. And pretty soon you'll be able to have, a true relationship with the customer. But right now, the customer has no clue what they buy. The majority of them really can't tell you what they bought. They just bought what the bud tender recommended. And the bud tenders need to be educated about a lot of this information. But it's tough to give somebody a comprehensive education when they're only getting paid minimum wage, because where are they supposed to be able to get this incredible information from?
And sadly, they already, in a way, they feel like they already know everything. At least here in Denver, the bud tenders are very know-it-all in a way. It's hard to even get them to listen to you on certain things. Not really me, but the public. Just
totally.
Yeah, they're convinced. They're already convinced on certain things.
Yeah, they're
like you were mentioning.
Gatekeepers.
Yeah, THC percentages.
And then what has to happen though too is that the customers, the customers are going to meet the bud tender, but the bud tender needs to meet the cultivators, and the cultivators have to be able to go through their distributor. So the distributor dictates what stores are buying the product. So the distributor is the link to the stores. The cultivator can't sell to the store, but the cultivator can find what stores buy the product from the distributor, and that then the cultivators go to those stores and meet the bud tenders and make an introduction and hang out with them for a second. It's not about pushing your product. It's about trying to push what's driving you to create the product, because that's the motivation. It's what is your desire, and then that desire is reflected in the product. And this way, the bud tenders can get an idea of, like, I got you. You guys are, you're about fuel. Yeah, we're obsessed with gas, and my location produces good gas, and here's some good gas to smoke. And then they go, damn, that's some good gas. So then what it does, it allows them, when someone comes in and says, hey, I want something gassy, they can say, hey, you know what? We just met this farmer. He has some killer shit that was fuely, and let's check out his product. it's a lot of work. And the problem is that for the cannabis farmers, they're overworked as it is now because the amount of bullshit we have to go through to produce this product is unfucking believable. So you're exhausted, and you have. But the thing is, you can't send out a representative. It has to be you. Your representative does not represent you in the same way. The farmer has to be the person that talks to the individuals, and you're not trying to tell them why you're the best grower. You're just trying to explain to them what drives you to in the desire to be the best grower. Because once you start to define who you are, then there's a competition in that. But there's never a competition in your desire to be better. That's something that anyone can agree with and work with. And so you're saying, this is what we're doing. This is what we're trying to do. Here's information about the farm. Here's information about the people. If you ever want to come and check it out, if you want to see, we can send you some stuff to see if you're ever in the area. And you use good human relatability to create that relationship. And then you start to have the ability to market your products in that direction. So I think that any of the old things that we're banging, as long as they don't have, and I think that you at one point in time, you'll have 140-day thin leaf psychoactive drug cultivars that people will buy. But you're going to be paying like $1,000 an ounce for it because you can't grow it for under $1,000 an ounce because it takes so long to do.
Sure.
But I'm ecstatic when they do, because we're going to be able to see things that are supernatural. And and it'll especially like say in Colorado, you're producing a thin leaf that's so cerebral it makes people think they took a hit of acid. You'll have people drive from California just to go buy a bag of it.
You guys are coming out here. Actually, we're starting to see you guys more. Yeah.
No, for real. You come to where the goodies are. When people want really greasy, oily, nasty outdoor, come to Northern California, because we got that shit on lock. And there's some killer herb in Tennessee regions, up in New England, Michigan area. There's good grass all over the place. It's just that, our area here has a tremendous amount of cultivator density in a good region. So if you wanted to experience a lot of different greasy, oily, nasty pot that's coming from sun-grown bio, man, I don't think you can catch a region on Earth that's got more, density than we do. And if you want to go see the biologically driven in models, you leave California, because most of the biologically driven in models like Michigan, Ohio, Vegas, the cultivators that I know that are producing premium are in those regions because their climate dictates them to have to be in a more stable infrastructure. And so as we start to be able to develop and build and refine what we're known for, I'd be able to go to Colorado just to go and check out an op and then buy the grass. And when somebody wanted some herb that's so greasy that it leaves your lip dripping and your teeth look like they've rotted out of your mouth because they're so brown from all the resin on them, then, it's where you come.
All right. Let's do some rapid fire questions. You ready for this, Kevin?
Okay.
All right.
Yep,
how important is it to mimic the sunset sunrise effect indoors? And that's from Clarissa. Shout out to Clarissa.
I don't think that you need to. I personally don't think that you need to mimic it. I think that you just put it on 12 and then for longer flowering like GMO, you run an 11-5. So 12-12 is a fixed cycle, but the stuff that has an exceptionally long flower, 80 day pluses, run them on 30 minutes shorter so that it sets that indeterminate period a little quicker, and just run it. Because the bottom line is, the more complexity we make trying to mimic all this stuff, and I'm like, you're trying to mimic the sunlight, but you're not mimicking the actual spectrum. So it increases in intensity and then it decreases in intensity. But indoor is really about how much energy can we impart to the plant in that 12-hour time period, which maximizes our primary metabolites, which gives us yield numbers.
All right. This next question is from John. What inputs do you recommend to steer the flavonoids and terpenes? I've heard that just by smoking if it's grown with guano or pig shit, etc. And then he mentions that he doesn't use guano anymore.
No, I don't use guano anymore either.
Me either.
Well, it depends on what's available to you. It doesn't really make a difference. Ironically, it doesn't really make a difference what you use. It's that you're building what's available. So to me, you always source locally, because then what it does, it allows you sustainability. And then with that local sourcing, you start to run your plants, and you're going to find the ones that shine under that situation. What we know typically is like sulfur seems to really drive terpene production. Flavonoid production, I think more than anything, is built off of complexity. The amount of different materials interacting within the media always give you better flavonoid production. So if we know that 14 elements grow plants based off of analysis, and most of these indoor models are really running a 14 element system, why are they lacking flavonoids when, some of these operations are, there's operations right now that are $90 million operations, and they couldn't be any more technologically advanced. But the bottom line is, why does the plant lack flavonoid flavor in a $90 million job? It's because you're really running these simplified systems that give the plant what it needs, but it doesn't give it enough to create the diverse chemical composition that we determine through our mouth. The human being, if you touch your finger to a plate, you can pick up 0.003. So we're calibrated to 0.003 of an inch with our fingertip. What's our calibration through our nose and our mouth? And so when you're trying to talk about flavonoids, just think complexity. And then when you're trying to talk about terpenes driving it, you got to think about how do you move terpenes through the plant, and that's basically through sulfur. So adequate sulfur levels get your terps up, and then flavonoids are through complexity of bottom end.
Thank you, sir. Tanner wants to know, I've heard certain companion plants increase terpene content. Have you seen success with this?
We were messing around with it using star thistle, because star thistle is supposed to have increase.
Yeah.
And so we made up extracts where we took it, we fermented it, and then used it as an inoculant in the soil. And then I allow the beds to have some star thistle underneath them. You just got to watch out that you cut it before they go into seed, or they'll seed your herb. But the herb was sharp and tasty, but it tasted pretty damn good in the bed that didn't have it either. And so I think a lot of it is through driving your awareness of how does that plant affect it, and is it really being affected, or is it you imagining that it's being affected? And so what I think the one of the best things you can do as a cultivator is to get people to test your flower that didn't grow it. Because they're not going to look into every little detail. They're just going to say, hey, listen, is it good or not? And what you do is you run your companion plants, and then you run the non-companion plants, and you test them. And that is going to tell you the truth of it. And so I still let some thistle get in there, because to me, it's almost like, I want to call it voodoo, where we believe it works, but I can't prove it because I didn't notice much of a difference. And it's just that I know that there should be some type of impacts from it. And it's just a matter of time where we start to be able to really quantify what those impacts are. So if you find something that works and it's quality and it's good and the product's good, it's good. And if you take all those things out and run it and it's the same quality product, then don't bother. The more you add complexity just for the sake of complexity, it doesn't make sense. When we're talking about complexity in the bottom end, it's not let's add more stuff. It's let's create a living situation. And then by virtue of that phrase living, it means complex.
Well said. Another question from Jacob. Difference in terp and cannabinoid production on cultivars with both auto and photoperiod types, then also between feminized and regular.
Feminized and regular, no difference. Right? They no difference in anything in those forms. With auto, though, you typically see changes because the rutarellus that was woven into the auto, it has very different life cycle requirements, because it has to trigger and finish in a short period of time, and it also has been genetically shaped to work under lower fertility, because the temperatures are lower, so you're having less environmental impact on biological activity in the soil media. So you notice that with autos, they require less food in general, less maintenance, because they're more efficient. It's kind of like when you have a large leaf, it's a better solar collector. To me, when you're running autos, they require less nutrition because they genetically have needed less, because they've been developed in areas where the temperature is dropping quickly. And as soon as that temperature drops into the 60s, we know that we have extremely low biological activity, which drives the uptake. And so these plants that were sourced were not sourced from indoor chemical operations. They were sourced from naturally occurring operations. And that material carries with it the genetic propensity in it to take up less food, but it also has a muted flavor. So the problem with autos all this time was that you got a muddy high and a muddy flavor. But what you're seeing is that when it comes to autos, there's only a single gene that controls that. So it's not a very complex mechanism on a gene level that controls this non-photoperiod dependent response. And so what you're going to start to see is some ungodly autos coming out because they realize now through molecular study what you have to do to take a normal plant and make it go into an auto. And so I think that as we move forward, you're going to see the quality of autos just go through the roof, and we'll be able to have a much better product. But in right now, if we defined auto, I'd call it a mid. And it works great for those that it just is, it's a B. And it works great for those that need plants that can work in environments that have a fixed time. And it works well for people that are going to be in tougher conditions because usually the Ruderellis, that base has a better resistance to fungal problems and has a less, food need. So it's cheaper to run, more resistant, just less quality. But once they move that gene into this next wave of plants and you start being able to bring that complexity of these other varieties into it, we'll weed that Ruderellis muddy out and bring in better quality. So get ready. You're about to see some autos that are going to blow your mind over the next year or two.
Yeah, I was talking to Jeff Lowenfels yesterday or the day before about that. He's really, he's really bought into it for sure. And I think he just wrote another book about it. Brian, sorry.
Oh, and that's, he did. Well, the thing with Jeff is that Jeff's a gardener. So like Jeff's in the gardening society, and he's gardener, not just cannabis. I bet he grew a lot more vegetable than he ever grew herb because he used to be a former prosecutor. Yeah. Right. And so for Jeff, he sees autos as this incredible bridge to get people into growing cannabis so that it makes it easy for them to grow. And for a lot of people that are new to cannabis, they don't have the same expectations that we as older smokers do, where we want it to be all things. We want it to be, good smelling, good tasting, ripping high, long lasting high. For people nowadays that are coming in the newer, if they have any kind of feeling, it's like when we first started drinking, when you were a kid and you drink alcohol, the fact that you're drinking alcohol is such an incredible thing that you don't really recognize you're drinking gin out of the bottle. And as you get older, you realize you should have mixed that shit. It would have tasted like that. But it's the same. We're all vomiting in response to that one. But it's the same situation that autos fill the void, and they're going to be an incredible tool as we go forward. But it allows people who don't have the optimum circumstances to cultivate, and we want that. What we want is as many people in the United States and around the world to be able to grow so that we can get rid of this ungodly misfortune that's happened to cannabis. I mean, cannabis has got 14,000 years of beneficial usage. And because we wanted to control the hemp industry so that it wouldn't interfere with nylon, petroleum, and the paper from Hearst, we demonize and destroy 14,000 years of shared information. And what we need to do now is get mainstream individuals of all societies to be able to go back to a more holistic medicine base. And cannabis is one of those incredible holistic medicines. And if they can grow some autos in their yards, so they got a little bit of herb to make some cookies so that it makes them feel a little better. If they make some tincture to make them feel better, if they turn it into a salve to make them feel better, then your neighbors become pro-cannabis. And we need that. Otherwise, what we have is this, we're some kind of oddity and the rest of the world is normal. And the truth was that the entire world was cannabis and the people who didn't use it were the oddities.
So Brian wants to know, I'm a backyard grower. Where would you recommend I send soil samples?
Oh shit! There's going to be soil labs. Go take a look. What you do is you get a hold of the agricultural extension, right? So there's going to be an agricultural extension office connected to your state. Every state's got one. So like I'm involved with the agricultural office here in Humboldt, because I'm a master gardener. And master gardener just means that I went through a program under UC, and it allows me to be able to get on a help desk and answer questions utilizing information that's been peer reviewed, proven by the university. So this way it's a consistent base of information. Does it mean it's completely correct? No. It just means that it's standardized. But the point is that these agricultural extension offices are where you can go there in person, or nowadays with COVID, it's easier to talk on the phone and say, hey, what's a local soil lab? Because what you want to do is do everything you can locally. So this way you can develop a relationship with the people you're working with. So this way, what you can do is you can get an education of when you're looking at the results, how do you interpret it? So the results are just numbers. It's really trying to understand how do we interpret the totals and the ratios. And so the agricultural extension office, you can go right into your computer and just type in agricultural extension office, whatever state you're in, and that that area, that county, and they'll pull it up, and you'll be able to say, hey, I'm a gardener. You don't have to even tell them it's cannabis. Just say I'm a gardener, and I want to be able to do soil testing, soil analysis. Who do I use? And you send out a little bag. They'll give you a bag.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just going to say, from the extension side of things, don't mention cannabis because they kind of freak out about that. And here in Denver, Colorado, at least, if you mention Dr. Elaine Ingham, they kind of freak out about that too. They don't really like her.
Everybody,
CSU.
they just let them do the testing. Yeah, just let them do the testing. They don't need to know anything about it. You don't need to let them know you're growing the dankest weed. They just need the soil sample. And if you're doing a soil sample, remember what you want to do is you want to be able to get not just a sample from a single location, but multiple locations. And so if it's a large operation, it's better to do grids and test in grids and then send it in. So this way you're getting a pretty accurate idea of what's occurring through the entire project. But it's basically you fill in like a 1 pound coffee bag with soil, seal it up, send it to them. They send back your data, and it's going to give you, your mineral content. It's going to give you how much organic matter is present. It's going to give you your information that'll help you understand, your water holding potential. It's going to help you understand your exchange rate of how well the nutrients move through the soil to the plant. It's a really good snapshot of a moment, and that isn't forever. It changes. And so you want to do them pretty frequently so you can kind of understand what's taking place, because really the soil chemistry is going to change. If you lay out your spring bed and build it, by fall, you have a different profile. So you want to be able to test multiple times through the year because it's not that expensive. And what it does, it just helps you kind of understand, what are the plants doing? What happens when I build a media, and what happens when it starts to consume what's in the media? And that'll let you get an idea of your movement. Remember, none of these things they're snapshots. It's not a proof of this is this. No matter what soil test you do, you test it again a few weeks later. If the temperature's changed, if it's rained more, anything will have subtle impacts on that test. And so it's just use it. Don't trip on it. Get an idea, and realize sometimes that, I was at a project in Colombia, and the soil scientists that they had hired to take a look were telling them that you couldn't grow anything in the soil. It was completely unfertile. And I'm looking at a cacao plantation that's growing in it, and I'm cracking up because I'm like, well, somehow there's this unbelievably successful cacao plantation growing in this soil that's unable to be utilized. And really what you were taking a look at was an ungodly fungal and bacterial population that had worked in a symbiotic fashion with that low fertility media and made it available. So even though the media tests, the soil tests said that nothing should be growing well, the quality of the shit growing out of it was supernatural. So you got to remember, the test doesn't define the truth. It just helps you see a window into the truth. Because if that soil was so bad, then why did they have such a successful plantation? And we realized it was because the fungal and the bacteria population was so unbelievable that it made it available. So lower fertility driven through higher bacterial fungal populations make more availability. And so that that's why, like when you're running with earth boxes, you want to back off your streptomyces at the end of the cycle because it'll keep driving the plant forward and it won't let it go into senescence. And so it's not that the nutrient levels are too high. It's the fact that the biology is pushing so hard that it's driving it forward. So just soil analysis is easy to do, and just do them frequently and find the cheapest company that's reliable, and just don't talk about weed because there's still weed haters. You know, we'll get them out of the system sooner or later. We'll get rid of them.
Yeah, they're still there for sure. I want to respect your time, sir. So this is the last question here. It's from Professor Bluntstash. I like that name. What was the 40.1 cultivar, and was it low in flavonoids? I think you had kind of gone over that, but just to clarify.
That was that Medellin 111. The Medellin 111 cut from Cookies. I ran it for them as a production. So I produced flour for the Cookies company on the farm. And the indoor version of it, I knew that it was sizzling. It just, the indoor, I've been doing this for too long, man. I just don't dig salt pot. And it's not that I don't respect what they're doing, and it's not that I don't respect what you're getting. It's just that biologically driven herb is always better to me in the mouth. And so the Medellin 111 couldn't have been a better looking herb and strong in that indoor bag, but the outdoor version of it I did at the farm, and I've only seen it indoor, through the bag, and then I've seen it outdoor through me. So I'm only using a very limited population sample to make this determination. But holy shit, man, that 40% picked up the flavonoids. No, I don't know I don't know the terpene level, so I'm interested to see what the terp levels are. But for the flavonoids, beautiful, rich, good in the mouth smoke. I think it might be one of my favorite new varieties. I really like that Medellin 111. It checked every box that I needed. It's just a little longer flowering, so it's a little tricky if your weather shifts outside. So it'd be unbelievable in a greenhouse.
Absolutely. You definitely piqued my interest on that. And again, guys, we want to thank our main sponsor for this weekend, Pit Moss. I also want to thank Miller Soils. Shout out to Lewis Miller of Miller Soils sponsoring Kevin Jodrey's discussion. And the reason why those guys were able to sponsor this event helped keep our costs down so that you guys got to listen to Kevin talk for only $8.33, which I hope that you guys obviously see that as a value. Up next is Joshua Steensland. So we look forward to learning more about his cultivation methods and the experience that he has. I know I have personally learned a lot from him, as well as Kevin Jodrey. So I appreciate your time, sir. And we look forward to seeing you guys again in about 30 minutes.
Thank you so much for letting me be on the show. And you're going to get an excellent lecture. Like I said, I'm probably the least qualified of anybody on this panel in terms of living soil. So, I think everybody that's, on this cast is smarter than I am and more experienced than I am in what they are. And so it's a privilege to be part of such a good group. And I hope that people got some benefit from the lecture today. And I wish you all well.
Absolutely, man. And again, we appreciate your time. I know that you're a busy, busy man and just had a baby. So congratulations with that.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. See you shortly.